Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the Twin Towers. Now, of course, we always hear about the Twin Towers now as a disaster and 9/11, and it truly was. But I wanted to go back a little bit in its story and also share my experiences with the Twin Towers and what happened on September 11th and things that I noticed or read or thought about. First off, the Twin Towers opened in 1973. You know, it was interesting. They were filming a turkey of a movie called King Kong, and King Kong wasn't interested anymore in climbing the Empire State Building. He wanted to be on top of the Twin Towers, and that was the case. And they had a big stuffed King Kong on the top of the building. It was kind of interesting. Of course, I was in high school when the Twin Towers opened. And an interesting thing was this, that nobody really liked the buildings too much. We kind of called them the kind of towers that only a mother tower could love. And it really didn't take off too well until a very interesting thing happened. A young acrobat, tightrope walker by the name of Philippe Petit, dressed up as a maintenance man with his assistants, all dressed as maintenance men. We had hardly any security. And they went up to the top of the building and ran wires so he could walk across. And he did, with a balancing pole, and did that for quite a while. I think if I recall correctly, there was a policeman who said, "You better get the hell back over here or I'm coming out to get you." And I guess that kind of brought him in. And he was promptly arrested, but the folks at the World Trade Center realized that this was pretty good publicity for them. And they contacted the police and said, hey, don't book him. Well, they had booked him on a lot of stuff. They had a whole litany of charges. My personal favorite was performing without a license. I thought that was pretty good. And, of course, he wasn't. He had to do some community service and some performances, and he was issued a permanent observation deck pass for perpetuity. And, of course, they became part of the fabric of our lives. We saw the towers. They were parts of, like, demarcation. If you were in the city and moving around and someone asked you a question, how do I get to? I said, look at those, follow them. When I would fly anywhere, as I was getting close, the first thing that would come into view were the towers. When I would go to Sandy Hook Beach, as you look across the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, you would see the Twin Towers in the distance. They were everywhere. You'd always notice them. In fact, I remember an interesting thing. I remember lying there on the beach, lovely day, and you could see the Twin Towers in the distance. And overhead, a Concorde supersonic airplane flew over. One of the last. It was just an interesting, surreal moment. Both of them are gone now, of course. And I worked in the buildings at one time. I worked doing repairs of some computer stuff back when computers were pretty simple, and doing repairs for some offices and coming in with parts and stuff like that, up to the 97th floor. And it's interesting. I remember going up those elevators, and the elevators would make a lot of noise. They would howl when the wind would take place. And I was up there during a thunder and lightning storm, and they were not fun buildings to be in. Other things that was interesting, the buildings would slightly move. Not greatly, but they were designed as such. Otherwise, the buildings would tear themselves apart. But one of the fun things to do with people was fill a basin with water, and you could actually see the water move a little bit. It was kind of an interesting thing and probably disconcerting for the person you were showing it to. I remember the attacks in 1993, which somehow have been forgotten in many respects due to 2001. But I remember it was the craze of all the beepers. If you recall, years ago, everybody had beepers, and you'd hear that all over the place. It was annoying as hell. And one day I was at work, and I was on the road, and my beeper stopped working. Turns out that's when the attack took place. There was the truck down below. The thing we don't realize about the Twin Towers is that they were built upon a 50-foot thick cement pier, because that's all landfill. And that truck was underneath it, so it was just too thick for that truck to do the damage, thank goodness. But of course, as time would go by, things would change. Now, I was in those buildings thousands of times. I was up in the top hundreds of times. Whenever friends would come to visit, of course, I always took them up there. You go to the Windows of the World restaurant, having cocktails up there. I remember many times doing that. Another thing also is the last time I was at the Twin Towers was on the evening of the 8th of September 2001. A friend of mine, Yomu Shin, who was visiting from New Zealand, I took him there so he could see some stuff. And he had his camera. He was an amateur photographer, and he was taking lots of pictures. And we were watching the blinking light on the top of the antenna on the North Tower, and looking at all the lights and activities and having conversations about the tower and trying to tell him all about it. And then those few days later, when all hell broke loose, and I was watching, I could see the buildings, the smoke coming out. It was horrendous. I had a book in my hand, and I wrote down lots of information that I was watching firsthand at that moment. And someday maybe stuff like that should be in a museum somewhere. Another thing that's interesting, after they went down, the massive clouds, and of course the fires continued for a long, long time. And I remember walking around the city and looking at people, many people wearing masks, and everybody had this distant look on their face, absolute shock, because it was just so incredible. Everyone had just seen hell and walked away. So many people were killed, and a lot of other things took place, of which perhaps inadequate information has been provided. That's going to all come in the future. But I want to talk about something. I wrote an article, maybe 11 years ago now, a number of years after the event, which I entitled, What Happened to the Glass? And what I meant by that, during the time of the attack and for the few weeks afterwards, there were all kinds of announcements of contaminants in the air, of which there were. But one thing that was very important is the fact that those buildings, a quarter of those buildings, were made of glass. And I guess my question was, what happened to the glass? And I theorized in my article that a good deal of that glass was pulverized and we all inhaled it. Now, I want to bring attention to something that's very important, and that is that many of the first responders, many of them have died. And in autopsies, sadly, they have found many different things, but they have found glass in the lungs. And that's what a lot of people were saying, including myself. And a lot of people weren't thinking of. They were thinking of contaminants. But the glass, very much like asbestos in shipyards years ago, get into the lungs. And as people get older, you can see a lot of this too. You reach a certain age and things start to happen. So you're going to see an awful lot of that, I think. So many first responders have died from a myriad of problems and diseases, from ingesting whatever it might be. The buildings came down, There's arguments about how they came down. The other thing is that while there are experts that state this is how they went down, there are pundits that say this is how they went down. And in all of these various reports about how it all happened and how they all went down and how they free fell and then pancaked, and later that was changed to perhaps molten aluminum coming down, mixing with the water and causing problems. The honest answer is we're not totally sure. The experts aren't totally sure. The pundits aren't totally sure. But it's become a hotbed of activity of something very radical, especially if you think about it, building number 7, which wasn't hit by a plane, free fell down. So there's an awful lot of stuff that's going to be learned. There's an awful lot of stuff that's going to be exposed as time goes on. Because, in many respects, a lot of this information isn't going to come out for many, many years. In fact, a lot of this information isn't going to come out until much of the present generation is dead. Very like the Kennedy assassination. It won't be till 50, 60 years from now that we'll know a lot of the information about 9/11. And one last thing to mention about this. I remember walking on the 8th and going into the buildings, and it's chance. It's fate. It happened on the 11th. It could happen any day. It's very humbling to have been there just shortly before and walked through it and saw everything, and people just 3 days later were killed in horrid circumstances. But this is the Titanic of the 21st century. And you will see, as time goes on, that there will be organizations founded that talk about the disaster. There'll be organizations that will look into the history of it, the conspiracies of it. And the firemen, the policemen, the survivors will be trotted out time and time again to speak about their experiences. And so very much like the Titanic disaster, 9/11 will be very much the same in the 21st century. And it will be news when the last fireman dies. It will be news when the last policeman dies. And of course it will be news when the last survivor dies, who will probably be a baby. Very much like the last survivor of the Titanic, in which they didn't remember anything. So just a few thoughts on the World Trade Center, the towers, my memories of them. I have a lot more memories I guess I should talk about as time goes by. But it was an amazing period of time, that massive cloud of dust that went for miles and everybody inhaled. That's a very interesting and important point to always think about. And anyone who lived in the general metropolitan area should always get checkups to make sure you're okay. That's all I have to say for now. It was a traumatic moment of time, almost 17 years ago now. Thank you.